recording. So welcome everybody to this SUNY Assessment Community of Practice webinar featuring our colleagues from Nassau Community College. I'll let them all, there's so many of them, I'll let them all introduce themselves, but just thank you all again for being here. I am recording this. I will put in the chat the location of where the recordings will live in Workplace, and we have a group in Workplace to discuss assessment related issues, the Assessment Community of Practice website. So hopefully if you're not there, you can log in there and get in there and access the recording there. It'll also be on the CPD's YouTube. So like I said, I'm not going to talk a lot. I'm going to turn it over to you guys, and if everyone could just keep your mic muted and when you're not talking. Take it away.
Okay, so I'm Elizabeth Gaudino-Goring. I'm the coordinator for academic assessment for Nassau Community College and the coordinator of the Assessment Fellows Program, which is what we're here to talk about today. The topic that we're going to cover is how we developed this Assessment Fellows Program and how this was central to changing the culture of assessment at NCC. But before I get started, I'd like to just let everybody introduce themselves real quickly. So again, I'm Elizabeth Gaudino-Goring, the coordinator of academic assessment, and I am a faculty member in the Department of Psychology at Nassau.
I'm Rosemary DeRiso. I am the chair of the Academic Senate Assessment Committee. I'm also an assessment fellow, and I'm the chair of my academic department as well, which is economics and finance. Got to put that out there.
Hi, I'm Robert Genter. I am an assessment fellow, and I'm a member of the history department at Nassau.
We'll skip.
Nicole, do you want to go? Oh, I'm Frank. Oh, go ahead, Nicole.
Hi, Nicole. So I'm an engineering, physics, technology. I'm an assessment fellow.
Hi, I'm Rich. I don't have my video on right now, so I apologize, but I'm an assessment fellow. I'm in the Department of Physical Sciences.
Okay.
And I'm Fran Gallinello. This is my first year as an assessment fellow. I'm from the Department of Communications.
Okay, did we get everybody? All right, so this is the team. And before I really get into how we've developed this Assessment Fellows Program, I wanted to give you just a little bit of background about the culture of assessment at NCC by giving you a little history of how assessment first developed and evolved. So our assessment committee was, which is a subcommittee of our academic senate, was first formed in 1989 in response to a SUNY mandate for improving assessment practices. And we're all very familiar with this idea that SUNY puts out a mandate. We have to try to do something to respond effectively. So what NCC did was they gathered a group of faculty members who worked with our Vice President of Academic Affairs to create a uniform framework for assessing student learning. Basically what they did was they presented assessment in a column type format, which I think a lot of people are kind of familiar with, where you line up your goals and then learning outcomes that are associated with those goals, how you're going to measure them. And then when you provide a report, you give some findings and some analysis. So there's basically these columns. And the way that we worked this out, there was a grid like this for every course that we offered at NCC. And so the committee tried to get a little bit of energy behind this effort to do more consistent assessment. But they were really kind of a small committee, and around 1994, about 5 years after SUNY first began this, they kind of dropped their mandate, and the efforts dropped with it. So the efforts kind of dwindled. However, in 1994, at the same time, middle states established pretty clear expectations about what they wanted to see for accreditation. And those expectations included ongoing self-study, effective outcomes assessment, and we had a middle states visit in 1994 that recommended that we develop appropriate systems for assessing program level processes and outcomes, as well as overall student performance from both academic and non-academic sides. So we had this recommendation to work with, and then in '96, the SUNY Board of Trustees established performance-based funding, where they would allocate resources to colleges and universities based on institutional performance of achieving desired learning outcomes. So, you know, we had some pressure coming both from SUNY and middle states to reinitiate our assessment efforts and try to get a little bit more power behind them. So the Vice President of Academic Affairs, once again, worked with the academic departments and the assessment committee. They put their heads together, and what they decided at that time was that they were going to continue to focus on course level assessment with this expectation that we would be able to aggregate findings from course level assessment to help us understand how we were doing in all of our programs and across the institution. So the focus of our assessment committee, which was really our boots on the ground for assessment, was for the next 20 years, just course level assessment. So in 1999, they decided to start an annual reporting system. And from 99 to 2008, what academic departments would do is they would try to conduct these course level assessments, and then they would submit a report to the assessment committee, where a subcommittee would review what they had done and offer some recommendations. But again, this is all kind of on a voluntary basis. There really wasn't any accountability for it. People weren't really required to follow through with any of the recommendations they were given. So it really wasn't given the effort that it needed, and it was a lot to ask of faculty members to do those kinds of reviews when, you know, it was summertime and they weren't really supposed to be doing any work at all. So it wasn't really a well-accepted practice. And then in 2008, they finally established the Office for Assessment and Program Review, which is the office that we now work out of. And they put an assistant vice president in charge of this office. So this new AVP worked again with the chair of our assessment committee to devise a new system for assessment and accountability. So they came up with guidelines for everyone to follow that were uniform guidelines, so people knew what they were supposed to be writing about. And all of the annual reports that people were creating now went to this Office for Academic Assessment and Program Review, where, you know, you've got a full-time administrator who's working all year long to gather this information. Now, another part of this annual review that the chair of the assessment committee and the AVP agreed upon was that they would have faculty reviewers, that annual assessment reports were going to continue to undergo a peer review, but they thought it was important for it to be an anonymous faculty reviewer because they just figured it would be more fair and impartial that way. So what they did was over the summer, people would submit their assessment reports on June 1st, and then over the summer, these anonymous faculty reviewers would look at the assessment reports, identify strengths and weaknesses, make some recommendations, and the AVP at the end of the summer would gather all of the faculty reviewers' comments and fold that into an overall evaluation that she would then send in September of every year to the department chairs. And in this evaluation, she would discuss some of the strengths and weaknesses of what people were doing, offer some of the same recommendations that the faculty reviewers had offered. And she would also provide an overall rating of how each department was doing in terms of assessment. And so down here at the bottom of this screen, you can see the rating system kind of evolved over time, but it generally was exemplary if you were doing all the right stuff, satisfactory if you were doing mostly the right stuff, and provisional if there were some things that were wrong and could get better and you really needed to work on it next year. And then there was the unsatisfactory or response required rating, which meant that there were some very serious things wrong. And in the fall, you needed to address these problems quickly. So this is the system that was in place for about 8 years. And well, how that went. So the department chairs and the assessment coordinators, who were the people writing these reports, did not like the feedback they were getting every September. They thought it was too critical. They thought it was inconsistent because the faculty reviewers would change from one year to the next or focus on different things from one year to the next, so they never really knew what was important and whether what they were doing was right or wrong. They were overwhelmed by it, and they really didn't think that it was helpful in terms of driving any efforts for improvement because they really didn't know what to do with the information other than, you know, hope that they were going to get a good score. So, you know, touching back on this idea of the culture of assessment at NCC, you know, it was a lot of what drove assessment to begin with was performance based compensation that we were supposed to be getting, that and if we didn't do something well, that meant that we weren't going to get the money. So people really had a hard time with that, and they viewed assessment in a negative way because of that. And then, you know, over the years, year after year, getting these evaluations, if you weren't doing well with assessment, you just continued to get this negative feedback that you didn't find helpful. You just knew you weren't doing it right. Another thing to add to this is that in 2011, we adopted some software that would help us to turn all of the paperwork into an electronic format, so we didn't have people submitting hundreds of pages of documentation every year. But the system that we created, the way that we developed this system was very complicated, and people were confused by that too. And then in 2016, we had another visit from Middle States, and it did not go well. So we got lots of helpful recommendations and suggestions in terms of assessment. The college, first of all, should further document the evidence of using assessment results. One of the things that they said is that we're really good at gathering numbers. We had lots of numbers everywhere. But we didn't have enough evidence that we were actually using any of it to help inform continuous improvement. So we needed to work on that. And we needed to link our assessment with strategic planning. So that's another whole thing that we can talk about, how we had to completely revamp the college's strategic planning efforts. That we had to develop a more systematic, college-wide, documented, organized, sustainable assessment process that measured the whole range of programs and services. You know, and I think that was the recommendation that really sums the whole thing up, that we had lots of efforts in lots of different places, but it wasn't organized, it wasn't systematic, and it wasn't sustainable. So what we found from one year to the next is people would kind of lurch forward with their efforts, and then they would just stop and stall and wait a few more months, and then they would lurch forward again. And it wasn't like there was anything continuous about it. And it was really hard to keep it afloat. And in addition, around 2013, we started really getting more systematic about our gen ed outcome assessment and our institution level assessment in terms of the outcomes. And we considered that sort of a pilot. And we were doing it consistently for several years within our committee, the assessment committee, but it wasn't getting that college-wide buy-in. And so one of these suggestions they had is, you know, you're off to a good start there, but you really need to get college-wide buy-in on that. So this is how we responded. That was the culture that we were coming from. It was kind of a dark, negative view of assessment. It was confusing. We were stuck in tiny minutia and not really seeing the big picture, which made it really hard for us to understand what any of this was for. So we needed to take the whole thing apart and put it back together. So in 2017, January of 2017, I was asked by our brand new Vice President of Academic Affairs if I would be willing to try to lead this effort to rework assessment and to gather together these fellows that could be our, you know, our leaders across the campus for changing assessment. So we started by revamping our annual department assessment review, those annual reports, and the whole assessment plan for the college. We reorganized the college-wide assessment committee, and again, Rosemary DeRiso is our chair of this committee, so she's going to tell you a little bit about how we did that. We started the Assessment Fellows program in an effort to provide more mentorship, accountability, and just support for assessment efforts. We developed this regular college-wide assessment of ILOs and gen ed outcomes so people all knew what they needed to do in order to do that effectively. We switched the focus from course level assessment up to program and college level learning outcomes so that people could understand how what they did connected to the bigger picture. And one of the things that I really needed to do, you know, in sitting down and trying to figure out what this was all about was get a sense, get an overview of what we were doing across the college. You know, I had some sense that there were some departments that were struggling and others that were really good. And there were some things we could do and other things that we weren't doing well, but I didn't really have a big picture. And so that's when I came up with this this heat map that I'll tell you about in a minute, because it really helped me kind of get the big picture of what was going on. So the assessment fellow, what was our vision for what this assessment fellow was supposed to do? The assessment fellow is a faculty member who is on reassigned time. So if you're wondering how you get faculty members to put this much time and energy into trying to make assessment better, they got reassigned time. So instead of a class, they would be doing this for several hours a week. Each assessment fellow had a caseload of departments. We had 28 academic departments, and they were divided among the 6 of us. Excuse me, the assessment fellows meet weekly as a team. We started doing that in January of 2017, and we continue to meet weekly as a team. We are all people who know TaskStream, the software that we use for documenting assessment. We've all been really well trained and very experienced in TaskStream, so we offer a lot of support in terms of just how to manage the software effectively. The assessment fellows also have ongoing professional development to hone their assessment skills. So they've taken the SUNY CPD assessment, institutional effectiveness, leadership training courses. We've also taken web-based courses from other institutions. We go to different conferences, and we present at different conferences. So we try to keep ourselves really active in the community. So the assessment fellows, the main thing that they're doing is meeting with departmental assessment coordinators, the people who are in the assessment committee, but also department chairs and program coordinators on a regular basis, or as they need. And they create personal connections with the departments that they're working with. And this, I think, has really been critical to changing the culture of assessment for us. That before we had just one person who was the face of assessment, and people get all worried about being evaluated. If they ask a question that, you know, they think might be a stupid question, they're worried about that. They don't want to, you know, reach out. And by having assessment fellows, having people who are reaching out to you, it makes people a lot more comfortable about just asking what they need to ask and asking for assistance when they need it. So that's been a really, I think that's really been critical to changing the attitude about assessment. They review people's progress throughout the year, which is important. Again, assessment doesn't just happen in May when there's this big rush to like gather data and enter it into a system or write a report. It's something that they realize has to happen all year long, because the assessment fellows are connecting with people all year long. The assessment fellows also conduct this comprehensive review for each of their departments and programs every summer. So where it used to be those anonymous faculty reviewers, now when people are submitting their reports, they know that it's their assessment fellow that's going to be looking at this report with them. So it's not so much an evaluation, it's more of a, you know, tell me how I'm doing, what do I need to do, did I you know, do this correctly, just tell me and I'll work on it, which is a very different dynamic than submitting a report and getting an evaluation again in the fall. So the assessment fellows each do this comprehensive review, and then for the sake of validity and reliability, we actually also cross-check each other's work. So every review that we do in the summer is done twice. We all review our own departments first, and then we review each other's departments also. And when there's discrepancies in what we think is going on, we have a conversation about that, and we try to clarify why there might be that discrepancy. It could be just the way somebody wrote something. or it could be that there's something missing that, you know, one person didn't realize was missing, you know, so it's really helpful for us to have that double check, so that we continue to appear as people who are fair and consistent and reliable in the way that we're analyzing these assessment reports. And then in the spring, when we go back, we review feedback with the departments and we help them establish plans for what they're going to do this year to kind of move assessment forward for their department. One of the things we did when we redeveloped the NCC assessment plan was to lay out an annual schedule for institutional and gen ed outcomes assessment. And we try to share this plan on a regular basis. We actually update our little book, that's our NCC assessment plan, and we hand it out all the time. We hand it out in the assessment committee, we hand it to the chairs at the beginning of every year, we have an orientation mid-year that we hand it out again. So this schedule, helping people understand that it's an ongoing process, it's something we try to communicate as often as we possibly can. So this just illustrates that, you know, throughout the year, starting in April, where we announce what the ILOs and the gen ed outcomes are going to be for the next year, so people can start thinking about it. And then throughout the summer, you could be developing your plans, or maybe just letting it stew if you're not really actively developing a plan. But in September, you kind of hit the ground running. You've got your plans for how you're going to do your assessment, and then you can gather your data over the school year, write a report. And at the end of the year, the assessment fellows, another thing that we do during the summer is gather the findings that people have submitted to us on ILO and gen ed assessment. And we come up with an analysis and a report. And that goes up for an institution level annual report of how we're moving forward across the college. And this is our ILO and gen ed cycle. So as I said, we had kind of initially had a cycle for assessing our key learning outcomes. It was a 3-year cycle, but it was an effort that was really kind of stuck in the assessment committee, and it wasn't, the whole college wasn't buying into it. They weren't even really aware of it. So again, this is something that we try to broadcast in as many possible ways every year: chairs meetings, academic affairs, assessment committee meetings, wherever we can get our voices heard. So this is actually our second cycle. This year is the beginning of our second full cycle since our last middle states review. And I have to say that, you know, we've had a lot more buy-in across the college, partially because of the communication and the consistency of it. But there are some other things that we did that also have really helped with college-wide buy-in. Another thing that the assessment fellows were doing was helping people understand that, and in their departments, they need to be following a timeline. So there's this college-wide timeline, but then also within your department, you should be mirroring that timeline, so that you're not just looking at your gen ed and ILOs, but also your program level outcomes, and thinking about what needs to happen within your department, again, starting in September. So we had this culture where people tried not to think about assessment much at all until it became a crisis toward the end of the spring semester. And we wanted to get people away from that, so they could begin thinking about it in September, gather their data. And again, you know, by the time you get to this point in April or May, you have enough findings that you can discuss that with your colleagues in your department or in your program and make plans for improvements. And all of that could go into your annual report. Excuse me. Okay, so going back to when we started the Assessment Fellows program, one of the things I needed to do was get an overview of what assessment practices looked like across the college. And while each department did get feedback every year, there still wasn't a big overview of how effectively the whole process was going. So in the 2015-2016 assessment reviews that were done, this was still by anonymous faculty reviewers, I used their ratings from that last summer to create what I called a heat map. So if this is a color coding system that I use to help me see, excuse me, how we're doing across the college. So as I had said, people had a set of guidelines that they were trying to follow. And what I did was I created a grid where I had those guidelines listed across the top on an Excel spreadsheet, and then every department listed down as a row. And for each one of those guidelines, I put in a rating based on what those faculty reviewers had said was going on with respect to each one of those guidelines. So a 0, which I would put in red, meant that there was no evidence provided for the standard at all. A 1, which is an orange, is that they submitted something, but it really wasn't adequate. A 2, there was an effort there, and it looks like they're trying, but they need to improve it, and we could probably give them suggestions for how to do that. A 3 was evidence was provided that actually addressed the standard, and we were okay. And a 4 was exemplary. So the hotter colors, red and orange are the hotter colors. The hotter colors on my heat map indicate areas of problems. The cooler colors, the blue and the green, indicate areas where we're doing okay. So again, these are the guidelines that people were trying to address in each one of their reports. And when you see the next slide, you'll see that I have them listed across the top on an Excel spreadsheet. So this was the first heat map that I created, again, based on the 2015-16 annual review that was done by the faculty reviewers. Across the top, you have the guidelines. And what you're not seeing along the side is the names of all the departments so that we can protect their anonymity. The departments are not listed alphabetically, so you don't have the accounting department at the top here. They're actually sorted by the amount of, by color, basically. They're sorted by their overall rating. So departments that had the most problems are at the top of the chart, and the departments with the fewest problems or doing the best are at the bottom of the chart. And when you get this perspective, it really jumps out at you. There's about 30% of our departments, based on this review, that we're submitting little or no evidence of assessment. I mean, it's all 0s and 1s and 2s, and they just aren't really doing much at all in terms of assessment. But then, so we're able to pick out which departments are struggling the most, which was helpful. Then if you look down toward the end, the right end of this map, you'll also see that there are a couple of guidelines where across the board, a lot of us are really struggling across the college. So responding to recommendations from last year's review, having some kind of analysis of what your findings mean, demonstrating any efforts and documenting any efforts toward continuous improvement. Those are the standards that we were really suffering the most with. We were not doing well on those, which helped us figure out what we needed to do first when we hit the ground running. So in this academic year, when the assessment fellows first began in January of 2017, we were starting up the program. We were trying to address these deficiencies that we saw in departmental assessment activities. We were trying to help people learn how to create action plans. How do you take the findings that you've gathered and use them for some planning? And again, another big effort that we had to get underway was getting everybody to understand the cycle of gen ed assessment and ILO assessment. So, we're still under the gun with middle states. They're coming back to check on us pretty frequently at this point. So, needless to say, everyone is trying very hard. And at the end of this first year of the Assessment Fellows Program, the change in our reviews was pretty remarkable. We've got this map full of blues and greens, 2s sporadically, but a couple of 1s still, but people were trying really, really hard. There were lots of responses to very specific recommendations from their faculty reviewers. And again, right away, you see that personal connection. You've got an assessment fellow who's been looking at your stuff, they understand where you're at, and you're trying to address the things that they're helping you prioritize. So it really, the change is absolutely dramatic. One of the things that we realized, though, in this second go-round of this heat map, and I got to give a shout out to Nicole, because thankfully she took over the coloring the heat map every year and putting it together for me. But one of the things that we saw here, and you can see it on this map, is where there's a lot of mixed attempts. And what we realized is we were assessing each individual department, And within a department, there may be several programs, and some of those programs were doing okay and others were not. So we had to put in sort of this mixed rating there, which led us to believe that instead of department level, we really needed to dig down and do program level annual reviews. And so in 2017-18, moving forward to the next year, we decided that we were going to really dig into each one of these programs and make sure that all of the programs were set up to engage in assessment in a meaningful way, and try to get consistent performance across all the programs. So the following year, now you can see this map is getting a lot more detailed. There's a lot more lines because now we're not just analyzing departments. Now we actually have a lot of the programs on the map too. Another thing I want to point out is that, assessment evolves, and so the guidelines that we started with back from the 2015-16 results heat map are not the same guidelines because, again, priorities are changing. Our vision for what assessment is supposed to look like is changing a little bit. So we had to really help people who are engaging in assessment understand how this evolution was taking place. That we didn't want them to feel overwhelmed and like they were always missing something. We had to try to keep them informed about this, but we did have to change some of these guidelines as we were realizing where we needed to focus our efforts. So there are some things like at the end of the right-hand side of the map is always about analyzing your findings and then doing something with it. But there are some things in the middle that changed a bit over time. So this is really our first opportunity to assess how we were doing in terms of gen ed assessment. And that was really helpful to us. Our analysis was asking a lot more specific questions about whether we were doing this in a meaningful way. Were we setting up our learning outcomes and our measures in a way that people could use the information? It was really giving them the information they needed. And we needed a lot more work on using assessment to improve teaching and learning. We really needed to focus on helping people see those connections. So going into the next year, now we know what we need to focus on, helping departments understand their findings a little bit better. We started to get a much better vision here also of the different roadblocks people were experiencing in terms of assessment. So, every department is different. Every department has their own culture, their own challenges. We have some departments that there were no full-time faculty members or only one full-time faculty member because of retirement. We have departments even now where we only have 2 or 3 department members that might be able to help with this. Their struggles with assessment and documenting assessment are different than a larger department where the issue might be just trying to get consistency across faculty or making sure the adjuncts know what's happening so that they can be rowing in the same direction. So we're finally getting at this point to a place where we understand the culture of each one of these departments and how they tick and how they communicate with each other. So that was really helpful. And the other thing that we needed to do was incorporate action plans, not just based on the minutia, the little findings people were getting from their learning outcomes assessment, but also helping them look at the big picture. What are some of the things you want to do in your programs? What are we doing as a college, and how do we move forward as a college? Can you contribute to that? So we're giving people a lot more to think about as they're looking at their assessments and coming up with plans for next year. And now finally, this is our most recent heat map. You can see it's getting very long because we actually have represented on here not only every program that's active, but also in red. The reason why there's red is because these programs are set up and ready to go, but they aren't active yet. So we have a couple of programs that are like, waiting to get rolling, and we've already started the work with them. They haven't started gathering data yet, but they're ready to go when they start admitting students. So this is what our heat map is looking like today. Again, I feel like we've got more green and blue than anything else, which is great, but there's still always room for improvement. So we're still trying to get people to document how they use their findings to improve teaching and learning. We do that in several different ways. We have, you know, individual reports that people put in our software system, but then we also ask our department chairs to talk about that and give us kind of the big picture of how they're using this information, not only for course learning outcomes, but also, you know, on department level, program level, how they're using this information for strategic planning. And then we're also trying to address more specific questions about our students. And, you know, up until this point, this is a lot about the process and not so much about, you know, what does it really mean for our students. And I like where we're at now, because now we're asking questions, you know, if 70 or 75% of your students are meeting or exceeding standards, what's happening to that other 25 or 30% of your students? Why aren't they meeting the standard? Let's start asking better questions, rather than just why aren't you doing assessment, or you're doing it, so check the box. So I feel like we are now gathering enough high quality data that we can feel like we can rely on these findings, and we can start thinking about what they really mean for us and how we can move the college forward in terms of addressing issues like inequality in education and diversity and things like that. So in terms of, you know, the big picture, again, you know, we had been doing ILO assessment for a long time, but the participation was low. And once we really got rolling with the Assessment Fellows program and the assessment committee kind of shifted focus, we were able to get a lot more buy-in. So using rubrics became a critical component of us being able to communicate across the college. We now have rubrics in play for all of our ILOs and of course all of our gen ed outcomes, which allows us, you know, across different departments to talk about what's working and what's not. The cycle is consistent, and people are, you know, with repetition, they're understanding this cycle. Our Senate has bought into this idea of institutional learning outcomes, and so, you know, everybody is on the same page. And with each passing year, we find more and more participation in terms of assessing the college-wide initiatives, the general education and the institutional learning outcomes. And for us, that's really been a tremendous leap forward in terms of culture. So the other thing that I think is really important in terms of culture is communication. We have to communicate this stuff in so many different ways. So the assessment fellows are really critical to getting out there and talking within the departments to the coordinators of assessment within the departments, the chairs, the program coordinators. But we also have to present our findings at any venue where they're willing to have us. And so we do offer lots of these quick talks to help people understand like what we just did and what it meant, and get some conversations going across the college. I think one really nice example of this is our information literacy tutorial. So our library created this nice little tutorial that students can go to and you know, move through at their own speed to learn about information literacy. And different departments have now partnered with the library to personalize it for their discipline. And that's really helped us with this institution level outcome of information literacy. And so in our next iteration of information literacy, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into digital literacy. The last time we added ethics on there, because that's not really articulated in the SUNY information literacy goal, but ethics is an important consideration. So we added that in. Next time we're going to talk more about digital literacy and how we can get our students to use the internet more effectively. So, you know, now we have more college-wide buy-in to these, to what's happening with assessment. The other thing that we did was move focus away from course level assessment and up to program level assessment, which within a department gave our programs a lot more focus and a lot more energy, which was really important for them. So we have we keep it like on a 5-year program review process, and that's continued. Our deans oversee that process, and the Office for Assessment and Program Review assists and supports it. They come up with a 5-year action plan after their program review, and we try to help them touch base with that 5-year action plan, make sure that they're going back to it and moving forward with it each year. And our student learning outcomes are now viewed through program outcomes, whether those are discrete programs or our liberal arts programs. So now I want to turn it over to Rosemary so she can tell us a little bit about how she completely revamped the Academic Senate Assessment Committee.
Thank you. Well, not just me, it was the help of many, but thank you for that. As we mentioned before when we introduced ourselves, in addition to being a fellow, I'm also the chair of the Senate Academic Senate Assessment Committee. And as fate would have it, I ended up taking over as chair of that committee the semester before Middle States came and failed us on assessment. So I had no idea what I was getting into. I had no idea what was yet to come. I thought I was just taking over and continue doing status quo what we were doing. But the goal or the role of the assessment committee is to facilitate and coordinate the assessment of student learning across campus, which is a very broad definition. Really acting again as that conduit between OAPR, the Office of Assessment and Program Review, and faculty throughout the college. The assessment committee meets once a month. We're on the Senate committee schedule. And for years and years, they were doing the same thing over and over again, and it was working. And that's not to, say anything negative going backwards, but when something works, you continue to do it until you realize it doesn't work anymore. And not because I'm chair of the committee, but because this is the truth. The people on this committee are some of the hardest working people I've ever met. They're committed to doing what they do, and they just want to be able to do the right thing for their departments, for their college, for the students, and get it done. So year after year, they were assessing their courses, documenting it, reporting it, getting that grade, as Beth mentioned before, are you exemplary? Are you, not doing anything? And for a long time, we thought we were doing the right thing and doing everything well, or as well as we could. So when we failed the assessment standard with Middle States, to say it was a shock was an understatement. I guess probably more people were not shocked, but a lot of people on the committee were shocked because they felt that they were doing everything they needed to do. So we had to look back and say, what were we doing that caused us to fail, and how do we need to change the committee going forward, which is, again, that self-assessment that I'm going to talk about right now. So if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. It wasn't too hard to see what we were doing wrong once we actually looked back and saw what we were doing. The results of our self-assessment, first and foremost, what came out was that the committee bylaws were very dated, and they did not only not reflect the work of the committee, but they didn't even reflect what Middle States was asking of us to do with regards to assessment. So that was one thing that we needed to address immediately. Some existing subcommittees were no longer relevant. Again, things were just rolling over year to year because they worked in the past. It doesn't mean that they were working anymore. I can give you an example. We had an annual assessment symposium every year where we would beg people to speak, and everybody would come and speak and talk about assessment, and you eat lunch, and it was great. But it really wasn't servicing the faculty the way the faculty needed to be serviced. They needed more hands-on type of stuff to do, and we weren't, again, providing that. Membership gaps. This was interesting to me. I don't know if it was as interesting to anybody else who noticed it, but some departments were not represented or were misrepresented. And what I mean by that is, once we started to cross-reference the roster of the assessment committee with the academic departments in the college, there were some departments that had no membership whatsoever on the assessment committee. And if you're supposed to be that conduit, that's a problem. We had some departments who had a member listed that had not attended in 10 years, which is also a problem. And misrepresented, what I mean by that is we had some departments who had representation on the committee, but that person was not intimately involved with the assessment in their department. They were not a program coordinator, they were not an assessment coordinator. They could be there, but really those other people, the program coordinators and the assessment coordinators, were the ones that should have been there and weren't. So we had this problem with the membership that we also addressed, and we think we fixed it for the most part. But I do want to talk about the bylaws and the subcommittees a little bit more. So if you look at the bylaws, and I really have to give credit to our academic senate who supported our changes and allowed us to write what we thought our responsibilities should look like. If you look at the old bylaws, and I like to think of the bylaws as like a job description, like this is what you're supposed to be doing. And I don't know if anybody's ever applied for a job based on a job description, and then you got to the job and it was nothing at all like the job description. I felt like this is what was happening within the assessment committee. If you look at those old duties and bylaws, every single one of them has the focus on course level assessment. There was not one word or mention of anything at the program level. There was not one word or anything mentioned about institutional learning outcomes or institutional assessment. It was purely down in the minutia of, course level work. So when we rewrote them, again, we wanted to make them comprehensive so that they included everything that needed to be assessed and how it should be assessed. So again, moving away from course level to coordinating the assessment of student learning outcomes at all levels. Again, course, program, department, and institutional. Again, to encourage and assist if needed. We know people need assistance, so changing that to encourage and assist departments and faculty in all areas of assessment, including but not limited to, and kind of spell out what they need to do and how we're there to help each other. Communicate those results. Again, that remains the same, but provide ongoing communication with departments and administration. There's a lot of departments and a lot of administrators. So we thought it was important to identify who needs to be involved in this process. So when we changed the bylaws, again, that letter D, work with the Office of Assessment and Program Review, the Vice President of Academic Affairs, your area deans, your chairpersons, and the faculty. Again, give everybody their responsibility and a little bit of accountability in the process so that it gets done and it gets done well. So those, again, thankful to the Academic Senate for allowing us to change that, and pretty expeditiously as well. Changing the subcommittees. We created new subcommittees as needed, and we're still doing that, to be honest. Sometimes a subcommittee kind of wears itself out over time. Sometimes new things pop up that we need. But some of the things, that we did add was a committee focused on faculty development. Again, getting rid of that symposium that we had in the past and substituting that with, we call it the May workshop, Get Hands-On with Assessment, where we literally will, hold it in a lab and give out lunch, and people will come and go throughout the day, and they will get hands-on help with putting stuff in task stream, with writing learning outcomes, whatever they need to get done. We try to help them at that time. Again, we do it in May because that's usually when the rush of assessment takes place. The assessment kickoff, we've had 2 so far, so it's now an annual event. We hold that in September, and that's really to announce what the ILO and Gen Ed outcomes for this year will be, and to give the community a sense of what the results were from the ones that we assessed the year before. And our faculty assessment orientation, again, the FAO we run every year, really shouldn't be an orientation anymore, but it's, again, mid-year to bring people up to date and tell them what's going on in the world of assessment. We now have a publication subcommittee, again, part of that communications goal that we had. Our first newsletter should have gone out the week that they closed the school, but it didn't, so my bad, I will get that out this week. But it was a newsletter on what we did in the fall semester and all the work that people are doing across campus with regards to assessment. And that's important because, again, it's validating all of our efforts and acknowledging that people are really working hard on this. And then our Gen Ed and ILO assessment, again, that is now a subcommittee where, again, more people will congregate and talk about it on a monthly basis and make plans and recreate rubrics if they need to be revised, and again, moving that initiative forward. We discontinued committees that were no longer relevant. I can give you an example of, we had a task stream mentor subcommittee where somebody who knew a lot about task stream, that's our learning management, our accountability management system, would kind of mentor somebody who needed help with task stream. And the fellows kind of took the place of that because they were helping the departments with task streams. So again, letting that die out a natural death. Revising the roles and responsibilities of the executive committee were also really important. Before I became chair, I was the first vice chair of the assessment committee for quite a few years. And that might let somebody believe that you were in a position to know what getting into the chair of that committee would be like. But actually it didn't, because when I was first vice chair, we really were responsible for event planning. We planned that symposium. And I wasn't very intimately involved with the runnings of the committee. I just was planning that symposium every year. So when I became chair, it might have sounded like a natural progression, but it really was not preparing anybody, not just me, anybody, to go into that position and understand what it meant. So the vice chairpersons became more involved in various subcommittees. Now our first vice chair, which is Beth, is in charge of the Gen Ed ILO subcommittees. Our second vice chair is in charge of the faculty development related subcommittees. So again, everybody's got more involvement in what's going on so we can understand, again, what the committee is doing as a whole. My takeaway from all of this, again, be open to change, make adjustments along the way. This might sound crazy, but again, all the other fellows can validate this. The first semester that we had the fellows program and the committee changes in effect, I think we came in every month changing something and telling the committee members something different. And I'm sure there were people plotting our demise along the way because it became very frustrating. But being open to that change and making those adjustments along the way is really important because we can't become complacent and just keep doing the same stuff over and over again. Assess the committee every year. We try to look back and see were the subcommittees valid? Were they good? Do we need to change them? Should they be, broader? What are we not doing that we should be doing? Aiming for continuous improvement. Again, the whole nature of assessment is to kind of look back and do things better in the future. And if the committee itself is not doing that, we have to set that example. So we're always aiming and trying to make ourselves better, but also understanding that Rome wasn't built in a day and neither is an assessment culture at any college. So it's going to take some time and just grow with the process. And that's my perspective. So I'm looking at the questions.
All right, so we have a couple minutes for questions. If anybody, I see there's been a lively chat that I wasn't paying attention to.
I know, I'm catching up. The all very true, Robert, was that people were plotting our demise?
Yes.
Plotting our demise and also all of the endless changes that we had to introduce. Changes to the changes.
Yeah.
At times.
It seems like you did a really good job getting everyone to participate in the assessment process. That was my big takeaway from what I heard today.
I think in such a big college with so many people who are responsible for assessment, it was really easy for people to be disconnected from the process because there's just so many people. And we only had one person in administration who was connected to this at all. And I really think that one of the big things that the fellows have achieved is just doing that, making all of those connections. So everybody feels like they've got some ownership in the process. Because as Rosemary said, thinking that, this poor person on the assessment committee who may or may not have any clout in their department is going to somehow run assessment for their department and keep everybody informed. That's just not a model that was working for us. So it's really helped for us to, get out there and really connect with people.
I think people just want guidance, to know that what they're doing isn't in vain, that they're not wasting their time or their energy. They just want some validation for the work that they're doing. And again, respect the work that they're doing. A lot of times the person who, and I say this all the time, so I'm sorry for all of you that heard it before, but the person who's on the assessment committee just drew the short straw and ended up getting put there. And again, just respect for the things that they're doing is also important. And I think we're making progress with all of that as well.
Yeah. I think that also that sense, I remember somebody when I was first handed the job of assessment for my own department, one of my most senior and respected faculty members said to me, "Why are you stressing about this? I'm going to give you a bunch of numbers. You're going to put them in a box and nobody's going to bother me about this again until next year when I give you some more numbers." And that was, I had another really senior faculty member say, "Why are you looking for, I assessed this course already once." Like literally she had assessed the course once back in 1999. So why do we need to do this again? Why are you asking me for this? I mean, it was definitely one of those things that was not, it was somebody's problem in the department. Everybody got that this was somebody's problem, but it was definitely just one person's problem. So it really, that's made a big difference, I think.
But I think also the support, knowing that it wasn't just the fellows out there doing it on their own. We're faculty. So we were doing the assessment right along with the faculty that we were asking to do. Mm-hmm. So it's not like we're sitting in a vacuum, they're sitting in a vacuum. Everybody's sitting in the same exact situation, doing the same exact work. We didn't ask them to do anything more than we would normally have done.
I wanted to just ask a quick question, and I just think this is so great. A couple things that I wanted to just say was that knowing the history and telling your story is so critical. And I think it'll also inform like the future of your work and initiatives. So, I mean, if I'm a new person coming into your organization, I can basically access this history and know where you're at any given moment. So one of my questions to have you all sort of be thinking about is, how will you adapt in this time of emergency your assessment systems? How does that become part of your history? And then the real like short question that I have for Beth is, where did the inspiration for the heat map come from?
Oh, that's a great question. So I was at a Middle States conference. Maybe it was 2015, maybe 15 or 16. And there were some guys looking at general education assessment in their college. And they did a similar thing just to see, like, you know, who was doing it and who wasn't doing it. That was basically all they were kind of looking at. But that's what gave me this idea that, like, we could get a much bigger view about everything about assessment, and you know, they drilled down, which is still something I would love to get back to, you know, like to be able to drill down and look at specific sets of outcomes. But that's where the initial idea had come from, this, like, you know, how do we get the big picture? And I took it from there.
Cool. I've always wondered that, so thanks for sharing.
Yeah, go to Middle States conferences. They teach you some good stuff, right?
They do.
They do. All right, any other questions?
I just put one in the chat, actually. We have a couple of faculty members who are really defensive about assessment, and there's nothing punitive that has ever come out of assessment. So I don't really understand where this is coming from with these folks, but our department chairs, you know, work with the faculty members in their department very closely, but we have a couple of folks that like to do these little side projects and not consult with the department chairs or the dean, and they're super defensive about, don't touch my course, don't get in my course, why are you looking in my course? You know, and trying to explain to these couple of folks that, you know, this is a coordinated effort. This is something that needs to tie to a much larger picture than just you and your course. You know, as you've painstakingly explained that during your presentation today. And this has like been going on for a year now. And how do you get through to those folks? And I'm sure you encountered that.
Oh yeah, there's still people who just aren't going to share their stuff. They don't want anyone to see. That's, you know. And I think one of the things that's helped is for us to say, okay, let's look at the common outcomes. You know, where does what you do connect to the bigger picture? And some people, you know, although you can't go digging around in their course and you don't want to look at how students are doing in every outcome in their course, if you're just asking, okay, well, your course is part of our gen ed offerings, so could you just tell us how your students are doing with respect to gen ed? And we're not going to call you out specifically. You just contribute your numbers to a whole bunch of other people's numbers, and we'll look at it that way. You know, so allowing them to feel like there's some anonymity there, I think helps, but also recognizing that they can be part of a bigger conversation. That's, people are worried about being evaluated, you know, and that I think for us in our culture, that was one of the biggest hurdles to get over. That they, no matter what you told them, they were sure that you were going to use this against them. And
I'm sure there's people that still think that.
Oh yeah,
no matter what.
Yeah, and we are still trying to convince people that it's okay to do course evaluations, like get student opinions on course evaluations. They're not buying it, you know. So, but we do have people that are still really sticks in the mud when it comes to this. They don't want to share, and we try to lead by example. You know, that when the rest of the college is doing this, and no bad is coming to any one particular faculty member, it's just, you know, helping us build a better college. I think at least they don't feel like they're in, you know, like in the hot seat, you know, because we don't want anybody to feel like we're targeting them specifically. It becomes a problem sometimes though, you know, like you've got a program where there's an assessment that has to happen because it's accredited, and you've got one faculty member who's in charge of that course. And that's a challenge, you know, and I've seen chairs try to, you know, use punitive methods. I'll put a letter in your file or whatever, and you're not going to get anything authentic from that effort anyway. So, you know, my feeling is we just have to keep moving forward and recognize that one year after another, we're going to try to make it better every year, and hopefully they will buy in eventually.
But I will say, if I can just intervene, and just so we aren't too pessimistic about all of this, it does help that all the fellows are faculty members themselves. And so I think there's a certain level of, I don't want to say trust, but they recognize that we are all in the same boat and we're all trying to improve student performance. And I can have probably more serious conversations about pedagogy and what we're doing in the classroom and the way in which assessment relates to that than a administrator might. And so, you know, there are a lot of cases of resistance, but there are people who I've been able to at least have much more productive conversations with about assessment.
And I think I just saw Nicole's comment about budgetary requests. I think, was it the associate provost of Farmingdale, Beth and I were talking to one day, who said that once he started to make that connection that assessment and your budgetary requests would be linked, he started to get a lot more data. When the faculty realized that if they were having problems in their courses, they would get even more attention, they all started submitting like, we have problems with this and problems with that. So not only were they getting data, but then they were getting like maybe more real data, or maybe, I don't know, less real, but they were more willing to be participatory, excuse me.
And making that natural connection to planning, you know, like, look, my students are struggling in this particular way. I really need that new thing, you know, and yeah.
It takes time.
It takes
All right, so I want to thank you all for a really great session. Like I said, we will be posting this in our assessment community practice group and workplace, and also on the CPD YouTube channel. I put the links in the chat, but if anybody wants to reach out to me for that, they can just email me at chris.price@suny.edu. And I want to thank you all again. This was really informative. Great to hear an example of good practice, you know, working, rising out of the ashes, so to speak. And I think are now exemplary within SUNY as an example for how to do assessment. So who would have thunk it, right? 5 years ago.
Thanks, Chris.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, appreciate it all.
Stay healthy, everyone.
Be safe, and
Be well.
see you again on Zoom probably next time.
Yep, for sure.
Bye, everybody.